The musty scent of old paper and forgotten memories filled the air as Rebecca sorted through the contents of her grandmother's attic in Salem, Massachusetts. The Victorian house had been in her family for 4 generations. And now, following her grandmother's recent passing, Rebecca had inherited both the property and the responsibility of deciding what to do with decades of accumulated belongings. Among the countless boxes of photographs, documents, and personal effects, Rebecca discovered a leather portfolio that had been carefully wrapped in tissue paper and stored in a cedar chest. The portfolio contained a collection of formal portrait photographs from the early 1900s, the kind that would have been taken at professional studios when photography was still an expensive and time-consuming process. Most of the portraits showed typical subjects of the era: stern-faced businessmen in dark suits, families arranged in formal poses, and young women in elaborate wedding gowns. The poses were stiff and formal, reflecting both the long exposure times required by early cameras and the serious nature that people felt was appropriate for permanent photographic records. One photograph, however, immediately caught Rebecca's attention. It was a couple's portrait, dated 1905, showing a man and woman posed together in what appeared to be an expensive photography studio. The backdrop was painted to resemble an elegant parlor, complete with ornate furniture and decorative elements that spoke of prosperity and refinement. The man in the photograph appeared to be in his early 30s, with carefully groomed hair and a full mustache that was fashionable at the time. He wore a dark 3-piece suit of obvious quality, and his pose suggested someone comfortable with wealth and social position. His expression was pleasant and confident, the look of a successful businessman or professional man. The woman beside him was strikingly beautiful, with dark hair arranged in the elaborate Gibson girl style popular during the Roosevelt era. Her dress was made of rich fabric with intricate beadwork and lace trim that would have been extremely expensive. She wore elegant jewelry, including what appeared to be a substantial diamond necklace and matching earrings. What struck Rebecca most about the photograph was the couple's expressions. Both were smiling, which was unusual for formal portraits of that era, when serious expressions were considered more dignified and appropriate. Their smiles suggested happiness and contentment, as if they were celebrating some joyous occasion, perhaps an engagement or a recent marriage. Yet, something about the woman's smile troubled Rebecca. While her companion's expression seemed genuinely warm and natural, there was something in the woman's eyes that didn't match her cheerful expression. Her smile appeared almost too perfect, too practiced, as if it were a carefully crafted mask designed to conceal her true thoughts and emotions. A notation on the back of the photograph, written in faded brown ink, read, "Mr. and Mrs. Harold Whitman, Boston Studio, October 1905. Rebecca carried the photograph downstairs to her kitchen, where better lighting would allow her to examine it more carefully. As a graphic designer who specialized in digital restoration of historical images, she had developed an eye for subtle details that others might miss. Something about the woman's expression continued to nag at her, and she decided to scan the photograph for closer analysis. Using her professional-grade scanner, Rebecca created a high-resolution digital copy of the 1905 portrait. When the image appeared on her computer screen, she was struck by the exceptional quality of the original photograph. The studio photographer had clearly been skilled in his craft, capturing sharp detail and subtle gradations of light and shadow that revealed the textures of fabric, jewelry, and skin with remarkable clarity. Rebecca began her systematic examination by zooming in on different areas of the photograph. The man's clothing and grooming were impeccable, reinforcing her impression that he was a person of means and social standing. His hands, clearly visible resting on the arm of his chair, were well manicured and soft, suggesting someone who worked with his mind rather than his hands, perhaps a banker, lawyer, or businessman. The woman's attire was even more impressive, with details that became clearer under magnification. Her dress appeared to be made of silk with intricate embroidery, and her jewelry was clearly of exceptional quality. The diamond necklace alone would have represented a substantial investment, indicating either significant personal wealth or a very generous suitor. But it was when Rebecca focused on the woman's face and hands that she began to notice disturbing details that had been invisible at normal viewing distance. The woman's smile, which had seemed merely artificial at first glance, revealed subtle asymmetries under magnification that suggested a carefully practiced expression rather than genuine emotion. More troubling were her hands. While her left hand rested elegantly on her lap in a pose typical of formal portraits, her right hand was positioned slightly behind her companion's chair. Under maximum magnification, Rebecca could see that the woman's right hand was clenched into a tight fist, her knuckles white with tension. This was completely at odds with the relaxed, happy demeanor she projected in the rest of her pose. Even more disturbing was what appeared to be a small, dark stain on the woman's right sleeve, barely visible but clearly present when the contrast was enhanced. The stain had an irregular shape and appeared to have been hastily cleaned, leaving only faint traces that would have been invisible to casual observation. Most unsettling of all was the woman's eyes. While her mouth smiled charmingly, her eyes held an expression that Rebecca could only describe as predatory. There was a coldness there, a calculating quality that seemed completely at odds with the warm, Loving expression one would expect from a woman posing with her husband or fiancé. Rebecca sat back in her chair, deeply troubled by what she had discovered. The cumulative effect of these subtle details created a disturbing impression that this woman was hiding something dark and dangerous beneath her beautiful, charming exterior. Intrigued and unsettled by her discoveries, Rebecca began researching the Whitman family mentioned in the photograph's notation. Her initial internet searches revealed that Harold Whitman had indeed been a prominent Boston businessman in the early 1900s, involved in several successful import and export ventures that had made him quite wealthy by the standards of the time. At the Boston Public Library's research division, Rebecca found extensive records about Harold Whitman's business activities and social connections. He had been born into a middle-class family, but had built his fortune through shrewd investments in international trade, particularly importing luxury goods from Europe and Asia for sale to America's growing wealthy class. Whitman had been actively involved in Boston's social scene, serving on the boards of several charitable organizations and cultural institutions. Newspaper Society pages from the period frequently mentioned his attendance at various galas, fundraising events, and social gatherings, always describing him as a gentleman of refinement and generosity. The woman identified as his wife proved more challenging to research. Records showed that Harold Whitman had married a woman named Victoria Ashford in September 1905, just a month before the photograph was taken. Victoria appeared to have no family connections in Boston, and very little information about her background or origins was available in local records. What Rebecca did find was troubling. Victoria Ashford seemed to have appeared in Boston society quite suddenly in early 1905, with no clear history or family connections that could be verified. She was described in newspaper accounts as a charming widow from Philadelphia, who had moved to Boston following the death of her first husband, but Rebecca could find no records of her previous marriage or any family. Named Ashford in Philadelphia during that period, the marriage announcement in the Boston Herald had described the wedding as a quiet ceremony attended by intimate friends, which was unusual for someone of Harold Whitman's social prominence. Typically, weddings involving wealthy businessmen were elaborate affairs that received extensive newspaper coverage and were attended by hundreds of guests from Boston's elite social circles. Rebecca also discovered that Harold Whitman's friends and business associates had apparently been surprised by his sudden marriage to a woman none of them had known for very long. Several contemporary letters and diary entries, preserved in various historical archives, expressed puzzlement about Whitman's hasty courtship and marriage to someone about whom so little was known. One particularly revealing letter, written by Whitman's business partner to a mutual friend, stated, "Harold seems completely enchanted by his new bride, but I must confess that I find her rather unsettling. There is something in her manner that strikes me as artificial, as if she is constantly performing a role rather than simply being herself. She asks many questions about Harold's business affairs and seems unusually interested in financial matters. For a lady of supposed breeding, Rebecca realized that she was uncovering evidence of a woman who had deliberately constructed a false identity and had targeted Harold. Whitman for reasons that were becoming increasingly sinister. Rebecca's research took a dark turn when she began investigating what had happened to Harold Whitman after his marriage to Victoria Ashford. What she discovered sent chills down her spine and confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of the woman in the photograph. According to death records from the Massachusetts State Archives, Harold Whitman had died in February 1906, just 5 months after his wedding. The death certificate listed the cause as sudden heart failure, which was a common designation for unexplained deaths during that era when medical knowledge was limited and autopsies were rarely performed. However, the circumstances surrounding Whitman's death were suspicious in several ways. According to newspaper reports, he had been in excellent health up until the day of his death, with no history of heart problems or other medical issues. His personal physician, Dr. Edmund Carey, was quoted as saying he was puzzled by the sudden nature of Mr. Whitman's demise, as he had shown no symptoms of cardiac distress during recent examinations. More troubling was the timing of Whitman's death in relation to his business affairs. Rebecca discovered that just 2 weeks before his death, Whitman had changed his will to leave his entire estate to his new wife, Victoria. This was unusual because his previous will had divided his wealth among several charitable organizations and distant relatives. The will change had been witnessed by Victoria's personal attorney, a man named Samuel Morrison, who appeared to have no previous connections to Boston legal circles. Rebecca's attempts to find information about Morrison led to dead ends, suggesting he might have been operating under a false identity as well. Following Harold Whitman's death, Victoria had quickly liquidated his business assets and disappeared from Boston society. The house they had shared was sold within a month of his funeral, and no forwarding address was left with neighbors or business associates. Rebecca decided to expand her search beyond Boston, looking for other women named Victoria Ashford or similar, aliases who might have been connected to suspicious deaths during the early 1900s. What she found was a chilling pattern that suggested Harold Whitman had not been Victoria's first victim. In Philadelphia, she found records of a wealthy textile manufacturer named Charles Morrison, who had died under similar circumstances in 1904, just 6 months after marrying a woman described as a charming widow from Baltimore named Virginia Ashworth. The similarities in the names and circumstances were too striking to be coincidental. Rebecca also found records from Chicago showing that a banker named Robert Patterson had died of sudden illness in 1903, shortly after marrying a woman called Victoria Ashby, who had claimed to be from St. Louis. In each case, the pattern was the same. A wealthy, recently married man dying unexpectedly after changing his will to benefit his new bride, who then disappeared with his fortune. The realization hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She was looking at evidence of a serial killer who had been operating across multiple states, systematically targeting and murdering wealthy men for their money. Rebecca's discovery of the pattern of suspicious deaths led her to investigate the specific methods that Victoria might have used to kill her victims. During the early 1900s, forensic science was in its infancy, and many poisons could cause symptoms that would be attributed to natural causes, especially in an era when sudden deaths from heart failure or stomach ailments were commonly accepted without detailed investigation. At Harvard University's medical library, Rebecca researched historical accounts of poisoning cases from the early 20th century. She discovered that several toxic substances were readily available during that period and could be obtained without suspicion by someone who knew where to look. Arsenic was particularly popular among poisoners because it was widely available in rat poisons and agricultural chemicals, and its symptoms could mimic those of common illnesses. When administered in small doses over time, arsenic poisoning would cause gradual weakness, stomach problems, and eventually heart failure, exactly the symptoms that had been reported in Harold Whitman's case. Another possibility was digitalis, extracted from foxglove plants, which could cause fatal heart arrhythmias when given in sufficient doses. The drug was commonly used in small amounts as a heart medication, but an overdose would be virtually undetectable without sophisticated chemical analysis that didn't exist in 1905. Rebecca also learned about chloroform and other anesthetic substances that could be used to incapacitate victims before administering more lethal poisons. A woman with Victoria's apparent knowledge of chemistry and human anatomy would have had access to multiple methods for committing undetectable murders. The more Rebecca researched historical poisoning cases, the more she realized how easy it would have been for someone like Victoria to operate with impunity during that era. Police investigation techniques were primitive, autopsy procedures were inconsistent, and there was a general reluctance to suspect wealthy, respectable-appearing women of serious crimes. Rebecca found several contemporary medical journals that discussed the challenges of detecting poisoning in cases where symptoms could be attributed to natural causes. One article from 1906 specifically mentioned the difficulty of identifying arsenic poisoning in victims who had died of apparent heart failure, noting that proper chemical analysis required specialized equipment and expertise that were available in very few locations. She also discovered that women like Victoria would have had access to information about poisons through medical texts and pharmaceutical guides that were readily available to the general public. Many household guides of the era included information about the medicinal uses of various plant extracts and chemicals, information that could easily be adapted for more sinister purposes. The pattern of Victoria's crimes suggested that she had developed considerable expertise in selecting and administering poisons that would achieve her goals while avoiding detection. Her ability to operate across multiple states and assume different identities indicated a level of planning and sophistication that made her far more dangerous than the typical criminals of her era. Rebecca realized that she was dealing with one of America's first female serial killers, a woman who had used society's assumptions about feminine innocence and respectability to mask a ruthlessly efficient killing operation. Rebecca's investigation into Victoria's background revealed an intricate web of false identities and carefully constructed personas that demonstrated remarkable criminal sophistication for the early 1900s. The woman who had married Harold Whitman was not only a serial killer, but also a master of deception who had created an elaborate system for assuming new identities and targeting wealthy victims across multiple states. Through genealogical databases and historical records, Rebecca traced the various names Victoria had used: Victoria Ashford in Boston, Virginia Ashworth in Philadelphia, Victoria Ashby in Chicago, and several other variations that followed similar patterns. Each identity had been carefully crafted with plausible background stories and supporting documentation that would have been difficult to verify in an era before modern communication systems. At the National Archives in Washington, D.C., Rebecca found evidence that Victoria had been using forged documents to support her false identities. Marriage certificates, death certificates for fictional previous husbands, and even letters of recommendation from non-existent social contacts had all been created with remarkable attention to detail. The sophistication of these forgeries suggested that Victoria was either exceptionally skilled at document creation herself, or was working with accomplices who specialized in such activities. Rebecca found references to a network of criminal associates who operated in major eastern cities during the early 1900s, providing services like false documentation, money laundering, and assistance with disappearing after crimes were committed. One particularly revealing discovery was a police report from New York City dated 1907, which described the arrest of a forger named Samuel Morrison, the same name as the attorney who had witnessed Harold Whitman's will change. The report indicated that Morrison had been suspected of creating false identity documents for a sophisticated criminal enterprise, but had been released when key witnesses failed to appear at his trial. Rebecca realized that Victoria's operation was far more complex than a simple series of individual murders. She was part of an organized criminal network that specialized in targeting wealthy victims and had developed systematic methods for identifying targets, creating false identities, and disappearing with stolen assets. The network appeared to have operated primarily in major eastern cities, where wealthy businessmen were numerous and where the social mobility of the period made it easier for newcomers to establish themselves without extensive background verification. Victoria's role seemed to be that of a specialist who focused on seducing and murdering wealthy men, while other members of the network provided support services like documentation, legal assistance, and financial laundering. Rebecca also found evidence that Victoria had been remarkably well informed about her victims' financial situations before targeting them. In each case, she had focused on men who were wealthy but somewhat isolated, widowers, bachelors, or men whose family connections were limited. This suggested that the network had developed methods for researching and selecting victims who would be vulnerable to Victoria's approach and whose deaths would be less likely to trigger extensive investigations. The realization that Victoria was part of a larger criminal organization made her crimes even more chilling, as it suggested that Harold Whitman and the others had been murdered as part of a systematic, business-like operation rather than crimes of passion or opportunity. Rebecca's research revealed that Victoria's criminal career had not ended with Harold Whitman's death in 1906. Following her disappearance from Boston, she had continued her deadly pattern in other cities, always staying one step ahead of any investigations while accumulating wealth from her murdered victims. Through newspaper archives and social records, Rebecca traced Victoria's movements after she left Boston. In late 1906, a woman matching her description and using the name Violet Ashland had appeared in New York City's high society, where she had quickly established herself as an eligible widow with mysterious but substantial means. The New York social scene of 1907 was documented extensively in newspaper society pages, and Rebecca found multiple references to the charming Mrs. Ashland, who had become a fixture at charity galas, opera performances, and exclusive dinner parties. The descriptions matched Victoria perfectly, a beautiful, sophisticated woman who seemed to have unlimited financial resources and who was particularly popular with wealthy bachelors and widowers. Rebecca's most chilling discovery came when she found a society page announcement from the New York Herald dated March 15th, 1907, the engagement of Mrs. Violet Ashland to Mr. Theodore Blackwood. The prominent railroad heir has been announced by intimate friends. The couple plans to wed in a private ceremony next month. Theodore Blackwood was described in contemporary records as one of New York's most eligible bachelors, a 45-year-old widower who had inherited a substantial fortune from his father's railroad investments. He was known for his generosity to charitable causes in his reclusive lifestyle following the death of his first wife in 1904. Rebecca found additional information about Blackwood in the archives of several New York newspapers. He was described as a kind, somewhat naive man who had been deeply affected by his wife's death and had remained largely withdrawn from society until meeting the mysterious Mrs. Ashland. Friends and business associates had expressed surprise at his sudden engagement to a woman he had known for only a few months. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the timing. The engagement announcement had been made just days before the 1905 photograph of Victoria and Harold Whitman had been taken, according to newspaper dating. This meant that Victoria had been actively planning her next murder while still basking in the success of her previous crime. Rebecca realized that she had identified Victoria's next intended victim. Theodore Blackwood was clearly being set up for the same fate that had befallen Harold Whitman and the others. Seduction, marriage, a convenient change of will, and then sudden death from natural causes. The pattern was becoming chillingly clear. Victoria would establish herself in high society, identify a wealthy, vulnerable target, conduct a whirlwind courtship, arrange a quick marriage, convince her victim to change his will, and then administer poison to cause an apparently natural death. After a brief period of mourning, she would liquidate the estate and disappear to begin the cycle again in another city. Rebecca felt a growing sense of urgency as she realized that Theodore Blackwood might still be alive and in danger, depending on exactly when Victoria's plan was supposed to be carried out. Rebecca's investigation into Theodore Blackwood's fate led to a surprising discovery that provided crucial insights into how Victoria's criminal operation had finally begun to unravel. Instead of finding another successful murder, She uncovered evidence of the first major disruption to Victoria's seemingly perfect system. According to marriage records from New York City, the wedding between Violet Ashland, Victoria, and Theodore Blackwood, scheduled for April 1907, had never taken place. The records showed that the marriage license had been obtained but never filed, indicating that the ceremony had been canceled at the last moment. Rebecca found the explanation in a collection of personal letters preserved in the Theodore Blackwood family archives at Columbia University. The letters revealed that Blackwood had become suspicious of his fiance's background when he attempted to arrange for her to meet some of his business associates from Philadelphia. In a letter to his cousin dated March 30th, 1907, Blackwood had written, "I have made some inquiries about Violet's background in Philadelphia, where she claims to have lived previously, and I must confess that I am troubled by what I have learned. No one in the social circles where she claims to have moved has any recollection of her or her late husband. Moreover, the church where she says they were married has no record of any such ceremony." Blackwood had apparently hired a private investigator to look into Victoria's background, and the results had been alarming. The investigator, a former police detective named Patrick Sullivan, had discovered connections between Victoria and several suspicious deaths in other cities. Sullivan's report, preserved among Blackwood's papers, stated, "The woman known as Violet Ashland has used multiple names in various cities and has been present at the time of several unexplained deaths among wealthy gentlemen. While I cannot prove any criminal activity, the pattern is highly suspicious and suggests that Mr. Blackwood may be in considerable danger." The most dramatic revelation came in Blackwood's final letter about the situation, dated April 3rd, 1907. "I confronted Violet yesterday about the discrepancies in her story, and her reaction was most disturbing. The charming, gentle demeanor that had so enchanted me vanished entirely, replaced by a cold fury that was genuinely frightening. She denied any wrongdoing but left my house immediately, and I have not seen her since. I have decided to inform the police about my suspicions." Rebecca found a police report filed by Theodore Blackwood on April 5th, 1907, requesting an investigation into Violet Ashland's background and her possible connection to suspicious deaths in other cities. The report indicated that Detective Sullivan had provided supporting evidence, including documentation of the similar cases in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. However, the investigation had been complicated by Victoria's sudden disappearance from New York. According to the police report, she had vacated her rented apartment, closed her bank accounts, and left the city within days of her confrontation with Blackwood. The speed and thoroughness of her departure suggested that she had prepared for such an eventuality and had established escape plans in advance. For the first time since beginning her killing spree, Victoria had been forced to abandon a target before completing her plan, and she had narrowly escaped being exposed to law enforcement authorities who were beginning to understand the true scope of her crimes, the failure of Victoria's plan to murder. Theodore Blackwood had marked a turning point in her criminal career, transforming her from a virtually invisible killer into an active target of law enforcement investigation. Rebecca discovered that Blackwood's report to the New York police had triggered the first serious attempt to track Victoria across multiple jurisdictions and build a case against her. Detective Patrick Sullivan, the private investigator who had uncovered the initial evidence against Victoria, had convinced the New York Police Department to coordinate with authorities in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago to share information about the suspicious deaths in each city. This represented groundbreaking police work for 1907, when different jurisdictions rarely cooperated on investigations. At the New York City Police Department's archives, Rebecca found extensive files documenting the multi-city investigation that had been launched in the spring of 1907. The lead detective, Inspector James McCarthy, had been considered one of the most innovative investigators of his era, known for using new scientific methods and for his willingness to pursue wealthy suspects despite political pressure. McCarthy's investigation files revealed the systematic approach he had taken to building a case against Victoria. He had obtained copies of all the death certificates from her victims and had arranged for several of the bodies to be exhumed for more detailed medical examination. This was highly unusual for the period, and had required considerable political maneuvering to overcome objections from wealthy families who preferred to avoid scandal. The exhumation results had been shocking. Chemical analysis of tissue samples from Harold Whitman, Charles Morrison, and Robert Patterson had revealed the presence of arsenic in levels that were clearly fatal. The poison had been administered in doses large, enough to cause death, but small enough to avoid immediate detection by the cursory medical examinations that had been performed at the time of death. McCarthy had also traced Victoria's financial activities, discovering a complex network of bank accounts under various names that had been used to launder the proceeds from her victims' estates. The money trail showed that she had accumulated well over $200,000 from her crimes, an enormous fortune for 1907 that would be equivalent to millions of dollars today. Most importantly, the investigation had identified Victoria's real identity. Through fingerprint analysis, a cutting-edge forensic technique that had just begun to be used by advanced police departments, McCarthy had determined that Victoria was actually Margaret Whitmore, a woman from a middle-class family in Cleveland who had been involved in several minor fraudulent schemes before graduating to murder. Margaret Whitmore's background revealed a pattern of criminal behavior that had begun in her teenage years with small-scale confidence games and forgeries. She had apparently learned her skills through association with a network of criminals who specialized in targeting wealthy victims, and her success with murder had made her one of the most dangerous criminals of her era. The investigation files showed that by late 1907, law enforcement agencies in 6 states were actively searching for Margaret Whitmore, and her photograph had been distributed to police departments, banks, and high society venues where she might attempt to find new victims. Rebecca realized that she had uncovered evidence of one of America's first coordinated multi-state criminal investigations, a groundbreaking law enforcement effort that had been triggered by Victoria's near miss with Theodore Blackwood. Rebecca's investigation reached its climax when she discovered the final chapter of Victoria's criminal career in a collection of police records that had been sealed for decades. The documents revealed that the multi-state manhunt for Margaret Whitmore had ultimately succeeded, but not in the way that Inspector McCarthy had planned. According to classified police files that had been opened to researchers only recently, Victoria had been located in San Francisco in early 1908, where she had assumed the identity of Vivian Ashton and was in the process of targeting another wealthy victim, a mining fortune heir named William Preston. However, her elaborate criminal network had finally begun to work against her. The files revealed that Samuel Morrison, the forger who had assisted Victoria in her previous crimes, had been arrested by federal agents in connection with a separate counterfeiting operation. Facing serious federal charges, Morrison had agreed to cooperate with authorities and had provided detailed information about Victoria's methods, associates, and planned activities. Based on Morrison's information, federal agents and local San Francisco police had set up surveillance of Victoria's operations. They had planned to arrest her immediately after she committed her next murder, hoping to catch her with evidence that would ensure a conviction and death sentence. However, the official records showed that Victoria had never been formally arrested. According to the police files, she had been found dead in her San Francisco hotel room on February 14, 1908. Apparently, the victim of poison, the same method she had used to kill her victims. The circumstances of Victoria's death had been highly suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry into her room, no evidence of struggle, and no suicide note. The poison used had been strychnine, administered in a dose that would have caused rapid death, but would also have been extremely painful, not the method a suicide would typically choose. Rebecca found additional documents that suggested Victoria's death had been the result of action by other members of her criminal network, who had decided she had become too much of a liability. The federal investigation had made it clear that anyone associated with her was in danger of prosecution, and eliminating Victoria would eliminate the primary witness who could have testified against the broader organization. Inspector McCarthy's final report on the case, written months after Victoria's death, had concluded that justice had been served, even if not through the formal legal system. The investigation had succeeded in stopping a serial killer who had murdered at least 6 people and had threatened to continue her deadly career indefinitely. The 1905 photograph that had started Rebecca's investigation took on new meaning as she completed her research. The woman's predatory smile and concealed tension had indeed been hiding something disturbing. Not just the evidence of past murders, but the active planning of future killings that would only be stopped by the intervention of law enforcement and the brutal justice of the criminal underworld. Rebecca arranged for the full story to be documented by the Massachusetts Historical Society and shared with law enforcement agencies that maintained cold case files. While Victoria's crimes could never be formally prosecuted, the truth about her deadly career was finally brought to light, providing closure for the families of her victims and recognition for the pioneering investigators who had worked to stop her. The photograph remained in Rebecca's possession, but she could never look at it without seeing the calculating coldness hidden behind Victoria's beautiful smile. It served as a permanent reminder that evil often wears an attractive mask, and that the most dangerous criminals are those who understand how to exploit society's assumptions about innocence and respectability.